This is a ManeHustle Media podcast.
Hello and welcome to the show. My name is Jackie O and you're listening to Militantly Mixed.
Yo, this is Sharmane from the Single Simulcast. And when I'm not making you laugh or making up parody songs, I'm kicking back, listening to Militantly Mixed.
ManeHustle Media podcasts are recorded on the ancestral lands of the Chumash, Tongva, Karankawa, and Hohokam people, and I wish to pay my respects to the people of those nations, both past and present. Konnichiwa, what's up, cousins? Welcome to Militantly Mixed, the podcast about race and identity from the mixed race perspective. I am your Sir Auntie, Sharmane Fury, aka The Blasian Blurred, and this is episode 197. My guest today is Maïko. She is the new Caucus Coordinator for CMRS, Critical Mixed Race Studies organization that I've been talking about the last few episodes of the show. I met Maïko back in December after I had joined as a member the Mixed Asian Caucus, which is being co-led by my friend Lee Painter Kim. And Lee had mentioned that there was a queer caucus, and if I had any questions, I could reach out to the coordinator to find out more. So I reached out to Maïko, and we ended up scheduling a meeting, a Zoom meeting, and during the course of that conversation, getting to know Maïko a little bit, I also ended up taking on the leadership of the Mixed Queer Caucus, of which I've asked my friend Jen Lee from Auth Ethnic Podcast to join me in co-leadership. But in that conversation where I met Maïko, I knew I needed to get her on the show like as soon as possible. And good thing too, we were able to get together to record, because from the time this episode airs, she will be days or a week or two away from having a baby. So I was able to get her before her life changes dramatically. And I'm so glad too, because I know I say this every week, but it's always true every week. I had such a wonderful conversation with Maïko. I learned so much about mixedness from a different perspective from my own. And it just reminds me how fucking awesome it is to be the host of Militantly Mixed, to have started a podcast where I get to talk to mixed people who come from all over the world and get different perspectives of mixedness, see mixedness from a different lens than I naturally see from myself and from my own experiences. I learned so much. I've grown so much as a person, I believe. And this conversation that I had with Maïko really kind of triggers me thinking about stuff like that too, of just like how being a regular mixed person before I started being a mixed podcaster, how I identified myself, how I identified mixedness in others is just so drastically different now that I've gotten a chance to have all these conversations with people from all over the world. The empathy and the openness to hearing about other people's experiences, but also like a willingness to try to actually like change myself and see mixedness through the lens of these other people that I get to talk to on the show. It's a fucking great job, even though it's not a paid job, but I invented a job for myself that is like the coolest thing in the world for me to do. So I say that to say that I would like to thank Maïko for taking the time, especially right before about to have a baby, to chat with me and express her experiences as a mixed person who has lived in multiple countries, who speaks multiple languages, who's married to a partner who has a different language as well, and is about to raise a child with all of that combined in them as well. I'm just so grateful that people take the time to share their mixedness and their stories with me for this show. It's just awesome. I never not want to do this. It's so good. Before we get into today's episode, a few just updates and announcements that I want to share with y'all as usual. As y'all know, I announced a couple weeks ago, the Be Your Mixed Ass Self anthology is now open for submissions, and it's been out for a couple weeks. We've started to receive submissions. They're rolling in still. which I'm so excited about. So if you want to learn more about that, please head on over to militantlymixed.com. Click on the Be Your Mixed As Self Anthology tab right at the top of the page and read through all those guidelines. Make sure that whatever you write or have written fits within those categories of approval. As long as it fits, go ahead and click that submit payment button at the bottom of the page, and then you can email your submission to me. Please make sure you read through all of those guidelines before you submit, because we will not be able to let you know if you qualified or not qualified until after the submission period closes, because we need to keep those submissions coming in before we start our reading through process. So you won't be able to have time to replace it if you don't submit it correctly the first time out the gate. So head on over to militantlymixed.com, click on the Be Your Mixed As Self Anthology tab, read through all those guidelines. If there's still something you have questions about after reading through those guidelines, feel free to send those through. One of the questions that I'm not going to be able to really answer is, here's the thing I'm thinking of submitting, is it eligible? The way you determine that is reading through the guidelines. As long as what you've written fits within that submission guidelines, then go ahead and feel free to submit it. We're not going to be able to read things in advance to just tell you if it's submittable. So please make sure you read through those guidelines before you send those over. And a lot of your questions are answered there. If there ends up being more questions that aren't addressed on that page that I start to see coming through, I will update the page to include those frequently asked questions. But for now, so far, all of the questions that have been asked are already answered on that guideline submission page within reason. I mean, there's been a couple that are like, can you read this and tell me if it's submittable? But other than that, yes, they're answered. I'm really excited about it, though. We've gotten a lot of responses related to it and started to see new people get introduced to Militantly Mixed because of the anthology. So based off the folks that have been sharing the post and letting other people know it exists, there's a bunch of new people who are finding the show, saying they didn't know we existed before, that they're excited to have a community that they can connect to within Mixedness and also submit something to the anthology. So for all of y'all that have just discovered the show because of the anthology posts, hello, welcome cousins. Thank you for joining us. I recommend just digging into the crates. Go back into the catalog. You can enter at any point. It's not time necessarily oriented. It's just me having a conversation with another mixed person. The biggest change you'll see is that over the years, as I learn and speak to more people and get more education about mixedness and mixed identity and intersectionality, I grow and change throughout that time. But yeah, you can kind of dig in with wherever and let people know if you've heard an episode that really speaks to you or connects with you, send me a message, DM, something like that, and I will share that with the guest that was on that show too. Many a time I've been able to reach out to a guest and let them know that someone emailed me about their episode, and it's always exciting for the person who's been a guest on the show to learn that their story impacted somebody else. So if you enjoy what you hear, please feel free to engage with the show and let me know so that I can let them know. Because that's how we build community here at Militantly Mixed. In addition to that, I told you all last week that I switched over to Anchor for my podcast host site, and a couple of things are happening as I get more access, as I'm getting more established. It takes a couple weeks for everything to sort of flesh itself out, but we have already achieved the necessary requirements to be able to connect to advertisers. So sometime over the course of the next couple weeks, couple months, I will start to get introduced to other advertisers that I can, decide if I want to use for the show, which will be a way for me to generate income for the show that is separate from me begging y'all to submit to Patreon, or actually Anchor also has a listener support thing that will become available over the course of the next month as well. But I'm looking forward to that opportunity to start gaining a little bit of income with the show. to help keep us going. But if you would like to sponsor the show financially, you are more than welcome to do that. In fact, you are the bread and butter of the show. If that happens, there are multiple ways to do that. You can go to patreon.com/militantlymixed. This is the OG way. You can sponsor the show as low as $1 a month to as high as anything you wish, and there are different reward levels depending on what you choose. And before I move to Mexico in a couple months, I do have some updated little rewards that I will send to people that are still currently active. Sponsors, new stickers, and things like that I'll get out to you as a thank you for your continued support. And I do also want to give out a shout out to one of our latest patrons. Shout out to Echo for joining at the $20 a month level. Thank you so much for supporting the show. As we get further along, you'll start to receive things from me in either the mail or email, and I really just appreciate y'all's support. The second way that you can sponsor the show is to drop some coins in the tip jar, as I like to say, and that's by going to paypal.me/militantlymixed. If you don't want to participate in a long-term membership or sponsorship, you can just drop some coins in that tip jar whenever you feel inclined. So shout out to Nina. I see that you dropped another bit of coin in the tip jar again, so thank you so much for that. And what's coming soon in the next couple weeks to a month will be the Anchor way of doing things, where you can actually go onto anchor.fm/militantlymixed and do listener support that way. There is a sponsorship way, which is not available yet, but will become in the next couple weeks. And there's also just a coins in the tip jar kind of way as well. Again, that'll be available by the end of the month, or I think I have to be on it for a month until it kicks in. But in addition to that, there's the kind of engagement and support of the show that I also think is extremely necessary in terms of helping us grow, and that is to interact. That is by sharing a voicemail on the Anchor page so that I can interact with that for the show, sending emails and DMs and letting me know about different parts of the show that you've connected with, sharing an episode. In fact, a personal share of an episode to somebody is one of the quickest ways of growing the show. If there's an episode you've heard that really connects you to, like, makes you think about someone in particular, and you send that link to them and say, hey, I listened to this podcast. This episode reminded me of you. Why don't you go ahead and check it out? That's a big way in which Militantly Mixed has been able to grow and expand over the years, where I've actually gotten emails from people that said, my friends shared this episode with me because, the guest has my same mix, and oh my gosh, this is how this episode affected me. So that is a great way to help grow listenership of the show. You can always also follow or subscribe on whichever podcatcher you listen to the show on, and make sure whatever podcatcher you listen to the show on, you also leave a review. Now, reviews, some people have mixed feelings about this, but with reviews, certain podcast apps will promote your show based off of how many reviews you get. And in the beginning, I used to get a lot more than kind of now, but that's because I don't actively ask for it. So I'm actively asking today. If you listen to the show pretty regularly, you love it, and there's stuff about it that you would like other people to know about, please feel free to head on over to Apple or Google or Spotify or whichever podcatcher you listen on, the big ones or the little ones. If they have a review function, just write a quick little review. It doesn't have to be too crazy, but the more of those that we start to get, the more that app will push the show into the eyes of people who are kind of interested in similar things. And that will help grow the show exponentially. It is the word of the year for me is growth, where it comes to Militantly Mixed, both in terms of growing a larger audience, growing to be able to eventually support myself with doing this show, and to grow the community interactions a little bit beyond what we currently have, which is mostly people emailing me directly, but I would like to actually have more community involvement and community engagement, even if I have to take it off of the Facebook group and maybe put it onto a separate, more welcoming app space or something like that. I'm looking to a couple of options, but that's pretty much all I got for y'all today. Let's get into today's episode. Again, my guest is Maïko. She is the Caucus Coordinator at CMRS, and we had it's such a great conversation that we have that I really feel like there's things that I've been able to kind of sit on and think about quite a lot since we spoke, stuff that I've kind of jotted down that I'd kind of like to engage with her again. Not anytime soon, since she's about to have a baby, but as I get to know her a little bit more through this caucus involvement that I'll be doing over the next couple of years, I do hope to re-engage her on some of the topics that started on this episode that I hope to continue talking to her about as time goes on. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our latest cousin to the Militantly Mixed family, Maïko. And today I am joined by Maïko Le Lay. We have recently got involved talking because I have joined a couple of the caucuses related to CMRS, the Critical Mixed Race Studies. Maïko, why don't you introduce yourself to the audience and let's get into it.
Yeah, so hi everyone. My name is Maïko, she, hers, and I identify as French and Japanese. I actually migrated in the US about 8 years ago from Belgium and France. And I've never really lived in Japan long term, but I have been visiting Japan my entire life, and my mom currently lives there. So yeah, that's pretty much about me. I'm on a postdoctoral fellowship at Duke University, but have been working from Los Angeles, California, where I will be raising my newborn baby soon, who is
Soon
about
to
to
be.
pop. Yeah.
So I was really excited. Well, okay. Full disclosure, every time I find a Japanese mixed person, I always get excited because of all the things I mixed with, Japanese was always the hardest to express mixedness with. So in that case, I got really excited when we first met. But you're also having a baby soon, so you're gonna have a multi-generational mixed kid. What's your child's mix gonna be?
Oh my goodness. So he is a boy. He's gonna be, I guess, half, quote unquote, half Indian,
Okay.
a quarter French, and a quarter Japanese.
And are you planning on speaking languages, all the languages to your child?
I mean, listen, that's the plan as of now. What's actually gonna happen is a different story. Well, that's a very big, question mark, because my husband and I speak English together.
Mm-hmm.
And so hopefully he'll speak in Hindi to our future child. But for me, I'm like, do I speak French? Do I speak Japanese? Do I do both? Like, is my child going to be super confused or like a master, multilingual person? I don't know. Like, I think, well, and it's not just about language. It's like culture. Like, we live in America. There's so much mainstream culture here. So how do you implement our own, ethnic and cultural values into that? So yeah, those are big question marks.
Yeah.
That we have no answers to now.
I've been following a lot of polyglot TikTok because I'm fascinated by people who can just pick up languages. In my Japanese side of the family, when my grandmother came to the United States, she was a military bride, and they told her not to teach your children Japanese because you're going to confuse their brains. This is the 50s. So she stuck to that so hard that even by the time I came around, after she's been divorced, my grandfather is gone. My mother is almost an adult because she was a teen mother. She still didn't speak Japanese to us much. Like, there were some words we always knew, mostly so we could talk about people if we were in public. So we knew like the races of people. We knew how to talk about money, and we knew how to talk about food or bathroom and stuff like that. Like, it's pretty much all we ever did when I was younger. And from that, what I know is that I have all the Japanese vowel sounds, but I just didn't pick up enough language, which was always a point of frustration for me as a child, but not from like my mom's not very Japanese in her behavior or in her culture or anything like that, where I am. So I definitely would like get the culture from my grandma when I was there, when I spent time with her and stuff like that. But then when the rest of the time I was Black or British, because I have a British grandmother too that would live on my Black side of the family. And I just like, I have an ear for accents. That's what I do better. I can't really do the language. And I've been following the polyglot because I'm like, what do you need to get your brain to be able to do this and not confuse like children of multilingual households? So
Right.
it's like a point of fascination, which is the only reason why I'd ask, because this episode is about you, not necessarily your unborn
No,
child.
but that's not a good point though. Maybe I should be looking into like, what others are doing and have been doing, but I feel like with parenting at the end of the day, it's like what you can do in the moment and
keep him alive.
pretty
That's
much.
the most important part.
And yeah, you can have a plan all you want, but
Yeah, who knows what's
life
gonna
is gonna happen. So
So how many countries have you actually lived in? Because you're here in the States now, but you said you grew up in Belgium and France.
yeah, I guess those are the countries I've really lived in like long term. Like I've traveled for a few months in other places, but I would say, yeah, France and Belgium is where I did most of my schooling. And then I came here first for an internship in LA, and then I stayed for grad school. And that's where I met my husband a few years ago.
So your mother's Japanese and your father is Belgian?
He's French.
He's French. Okay,
Yeah.
but you just lived. I mean,
Yeah, they separated, and so my mom found a job in Belgium. Um, I guess there was a big Japanese company that was there in Belgium, which recruited at that moment, and so she and I moved there. Um, yeah, so yeah, when you talk about how the military experience that you had, or Asian Americans or Japanese Americans in the US kind of like having to suppress their Japanese-ness for many reasons, that's definitely not what happens with Japanese in Europe.
yeah, I'm
Um,
learning that
oddly-
only recently. Am I starting
I
to
mean,
realize that?
at least, in the Western side of Europe, because most of the Japanese that are there are choosing immigrants and not forced, immigrants. And there's just no history of violence per se.
Right,
Um, I mean, maybe more recently with the whole COVID and anti-Asian hate, but
yeah,
even that's still a very sort of American, like what's happening is really, I think, siloed in the US. At least the way it is happening and the way we talk about race and Japanese-ness. So it's extremely different. So I think the European experience for Japanese people and is so different than what's happening in the US. And so definitely, even for me, even if I lived in the Western world in Europe, coming here was a huge cultural shock.
I imagine. Yeah, because every time we've been to some place in Europe, we've used my grandmother's Japanese almost as much as we have used English or French. So I told you I speak a little bit of French from school. And back when we went to France, I spoke more than I can now. And she would pop away, like we'd let her disappear, and she'd go to like a Japanese tour group because there was Japanese tour groups all over the place. And then she'd come back and be like, "Oh, the restaurant that we're talking about is over there," or like she would find out that way. So actually, she got to use Japanese quite a bit in France at restaurants and hotels, like all over the place. It was kind of interesting that we weren't paid attention to as . Necessarily.
Well, I guess there is more of this like tourist identity if you are a Japanese person in Europe, like you are labeled as a tourist. Here, I learned that coming here is that being Japanese is being a minority. It's being, because of the history of like Japanese and then American uh, like the whole,
The internment.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And which I was not aware of at all. It's like there were camps in the US. Like I didn't know that
Oh, that,
history
yeah. I guess that would make sense
whatsoever.
that you would never have heard that in school and
Yeah,
things like
and
that. Yeah.
in Europe, I mean, I guess I was a minority because there was nobody mixed around me. Um, but I never, I guess, I mean, I struggled a lot with my mixedness, but I never considered myself a minority. Um, like like my colleagues from the African continent, for example, or the South American continent. I never saw myself that way. And then I came into the US and I was involved in like advocacy and lobbying. And then somebody called me a woman of color. And I knew the term woman of
Mm.
color and the connotation that goes with it. Like a
Mm-hmm.
person of color, it has this whole like minority concept around it. And I was like, me? Like I'm a minority, I'm a person of color in that sense. And I've never seen
Yeah.
myself that way. I always seen myself as just, oh, I'm different. Or, oh, I speak Japanese.
Mm.
Or I'm a Buddhist, I'm a Shinto. But I never seen myself like, sort of a different social and racial ethnic hierarchy until I
Right.
came to the US. Um, and and then I realized that um, that portrayal of me by others saying, "Oh, this is a woman of color," to me was not really accurate because I didn't grow up in the US as a woman of color.
Right.
I didn't have the experience of what women of color in the US go through. I came in as a 25-year-old
Mm-hmm.
choosing immigrant, got to go to grad school.
Yeah.
And yes, in this setting now, because of my ethnic heritage and my cultural knowledge, I am minoritized.
Do you feel like you're more, say, obviously a minority? For like, do people treat you like a more obvious minority here versus back home? Were you ever approached as with the question of like, what are you?
Well, I think what's really complicated today is that I'm hyper aware of my privileged
Sure.
uh, because of my education. Like I have a PhD.
Right.
Um, and that sort of almost, it doesn't trump, but it it really does something in terms
It
of,
does help in quotation,
yeah. And
versus,
I
yeah.
mean, I do have an accent, so people realize that I'm not from here. But what I meant to say is that I don't really identify as a woman of color in the US sense of the
Sense of it,
term.
yeah.
I identify as a international immigrant woman of color. Sorry, an international woman immigrant, if that makes
Right.
sense.
No, yeah,
And
that does, yeah.
um and that comes with its whole set of issues, being, even if you're choosing immigrant, the fact that you're just not American and period comes with so many complications.
Right.
And um and, and I was talking to my husband recently, and I realized something also. I've been in the US for 8 years. I've dated people before my husband. um, but one thing I realized is that I probably stick with him and felt the most comfortable with him because he was also an
Right.
international immigrant. And so I think that's kind of the part of my identity that in the US here at this moment, it is really what sticks with me, is really what's important to me, as opposed to feeling, oh, I'm Japanese, so I'm a minority, or I'm French,
Right.
so I'm like this cool little, Emily in Paris chick, like,
Mm-hmm.
um, I don't see myself as that. I really see myself as this someone who decided to immigrate, and with all the complication that goes with it. And
Right.
there's visas, there are a lot of things we are not allowed to do, and just people how they other you, period, like they exoticize you.
You find that happens far more here in the States than it ever did back in Europe?
Yes,
Or depending
definitely.
where in Europe you were ever at, maybe?
Yeah, and I mean, I guess the exoticization has always happened,
Mm.
but in Belgium or France, French has always been my native tongue, so I didn't have an accent.
Right.
So yeah, I look different, but people would not question my Frenchness. Here, of course, I have an accent, so people can automatically know that I'm not from the US. Um, and again, questions of race and ethnicity is so prevalent here
Yeah.
in ways that are kind of not there, at least for people who appear whiter, like I do.
Right.
Um,
Do you get seen as Asian very often in spaces? Do people automatically come up to you and kind of talk to you like they know that you're Asian?
Nowhere in the world,
Nowhere in
people
the
would
world.
guess. No, like, when I was in Europe, people were like, "Oh, are you from Morocco? Or are you from Turkey? Or are you from
Yeah,
Tahiti?"
I can see that.
Um, Here, people are like, "Are you Mexican? Are you Hawaiian?" And that's fine, like I don't mind appearing whatever people like. It's their imagination, and guesses. I don't mind that at all, but it's more like you cannot know my story. When I'm here, it's hard for people to understand my story because people have not chosen to leave their home to live somewhere else. And I'm proud of my choice. It's just it's complicated to immigrate. And you'll
Yeah.
live that soon when you're gonna
Yeah,
go
when I
to
go, yeah.
Mexico.
Well,
It's
what's interesting with
thing.
Americans, U.S. Americans, is that the idea of immigrant here means first illegal
Mhm.
in a lot of the mainstream mind,
Mm.
which is unfortunate because most of the people who come here aren't coming here illegally. But the way our system is set up, some people get kind of forced into undocumented status
Mhm,
and things
mhm.
like that. But if you're an immigrant from a place, especially a European immigrant, that comes with class, that comes with status, that comes
Mhm,
with
mhm.
a upper echelon belief, and so your treatment, even as being an immigrant, your treatment might be slightly better than a darker skinned person, anyways, or more
Mhm,
overtly, especially from the southern border
mhm,
is
mhm.
where people are treated the worst here, I think, in terms of immigrant status. It's also choosing to acknowledge your immigrant status here is also something that's kind of surprising, because if you're not, say, Mexican or South American, it's like, wait, why would you tell people that? Like, it's kind
Mm.
of a jarring thing, I think, for like the way the U.S. Americans think about that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
And so for us, like for me, a second generation American on both of my grandmother's sides, but
Mm.
multiple generation American from the United States, or from my grandfather's sides, I get their immigrant status by association,
Mhm.
because I'm not an obvious white person. So it'll be
Mhm.
like, oh, where are you from? You obviously come from somewhere else.
Mhm.
And with you, like, yeah, you're lighter skin. Like, to me, you're I don't know, like, I wouldn't necessarily know what you were, but I would say that person is either a mixed person, or I can kind of see how somebody would, try to map out and try to find, like, are they Middle Eastern? Are they? Whereas, like, here is the same thing. It depends on what side of the coast you are. On the
Yeah.
East Coast, I'm Dominican or Puerto Rican. On the West
Mm.
Coast, I'm Filipino or
Mm.
Mexican, because those are the people that they see more of.
Right, right,
That
right.
they're just kind of trying to pinpoint you in some way, shape, or form. So I think it's a combination of what you deal with is like a combination of that you acknowledge your immigrant status, even though you are a grad student, PhD, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Like, it's they're not expecting to hear someone say it.
Yeah, I know. I think, you know, every immigrant, whether your big quote and quotes, please really think of this quote unquote low skill versus high
Right,
skill. I
right.
really hate those terms, but that's how it's called in social science books. Unfortunately, um, every immigrant will have a tough time, and um, in terms of what they go through personally. Of course, the quote unquote lower skilled you are, you're gonna experience even more discrimination and whatnot. But there is a big personal work you need to do, internal work you need to do when you move away to a different country that speaks a different language, that sees race and ethnicity in a very different manner and has a different history and um, relationship to your ethnic background and cultural background. Um, and I realized, for example, when I was in grad school, they were really quick to sort of say, like, I guess use me as their diversity quota, in
Mm,
the sense that, oh, this is,
yeah.
the Japanese and French
Like with
scholar.
you, they get more than one, so it's a better.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
I've
mean,
had that exact thing said to me in places before too.
and it's like, oh, like this international scholar and this and that, blah, blah, blah. But then in reality, so I thought I would receive support, and and there was, like, there are resources in place for international scholar. I'm not saying I didn't, but people are quick to hire international applicants because it looks good. They maybe bring money, I don't know, but at the end of the day, they have no idea what these folks go through, and there's not the kind of support that they really need.
Right.
And so, even the concept of money, like, we we don't budget differently. Like, it's not just going through a cultural shock. It's about, um, we have families back home. We had to save a lot of money to come here, and you're about to lose it in 2 weeks because everything is so much overpriced here. Like,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Mm-hmm.
so I think, yeah, they're quick to feel like, oh, this is a cool thing, without really knowing what goes through, and all the hurdles that we have to go through. And so once you're in, but then it's hard to stay. And I guess a lot of international scholars, I mean, grad school is hard in general, but a lot of international scholars do have mental health issues because of these problems that are not talked about, and you know um, are not followed through as they
Right.
should. um,
I feel like even there, because I used to work in HR in the tech field, and we would hire a lot of engineers from Asia and South Asia, and it's just this expectation that you know all of our stuff because we're the U.S., we're America, right? So you get our TV, you get our movies, you get our culture, so you should also understand our money system. You should also understand the way socioeconomic status is. Like you should just understand this. So there's no support in that
mhm,
area. And I didn't realize until I kind of moved up in HR, the people that would come to ask me questions, they usually were very basic things like, you know, was $93,000 a year a reasonable amount of money to live in LA? Or maybe they did know, but they're like, okay, I thought this was going to be enough money, but since the office moved to this area, now all the houses are, way more. Like, how do you balance what you're making with where you're forced to live and stuff like that? And
mhm,
we don't have anything for that.
mhm,
And it's just like, that's your problem. And so I found it very difficult to keep working in that industry because I couldn't be a support in the way I didn't have the support to lend the support. I could only
mhm,
do what
mhm,
I could do based off the fact that I knew what it was like to have grandmothers from other countries who I lived with, who we lived in the same house. And so like I would see what they would, experience. But I'm also a kid that grew up here. And it's interesting how quickly it's like, yes, there's some cachet in being able to get, this coveted person in engineering from India or something like that. But when they get here, there's no support. Like you're kind of given a big package at the beginning. And then after that, it's like, go out in the world.
Yeah,
And
you're
figure it
like,
out.
okay, come, it's going to be wonderful.
Yeah.
And then you're kind of left on your own. And that's why, I know personally, I tend to, like my friend community tend to be international folks just because we understand each other, whether I don't have necessarily mixed Asian friends much, or at all. I don't know any of them except through work, through the research I do. But it's a thing, it's different. And I'm not saying, oh, I don't identify or I cannot get along with, let's say, Asian Americans or Americans from different ethnic or racial background. It's just the deeper level of understanding will never be the same.
Right.
Because, and again, I'm sure once, for example, you're going to immigrate to Mexico, we will maybe have way more in common than, even if it's different countries, different languages and stuff, but just the crossing a border and having to go through a shit ton of things. And again, and another thing is there's something about immigrating when you're a kid where you are with your parents. That's a whole set of another, I mean, I can't imagine immigrating during middle school or high school in your teenage. It must be
Right.
terrifying.
Yeah.
But kids tend to pick up things really quickly. They're smart, and but unfortunately, it can also cause trauma. Then you have the more, let's say, mature adults who immigrates in their 30s or 40s, who do their research, um, who maybe have a company or something, a system that supports them. And then you have people like me who were in their mid-20s and you like had the American dream and came from an internship that was unpaid, and just came with one suitcase with just tons of dream in their head and nothing more. And you kind of have to learn on the spot. But again, I think everything changed the day I met my husband. Before that, it was just a struggle every day. Like I was like, I know I need to stay here. Like in the back of my mind, there was something that pulled me here in the US. I want to do racial equity work. I want to work in arts and culture here. I knew that, but in the same time, I felt out of place. I hated it.
Yeah.
Until I was able to find sort of a partner that was like, let's do this together. Like
Right.
it's not easy, so let's do this together and let's figure things out together. And once I found sort of that strong pillar in my life, things got much easier.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think at the heart of almost everything, and it's a big part of why I even started this show in particular and all the other shows that I do as well, is that need for community that we have as people. I grew up predominantly in Black spaces, and even though I'm very pale, Black people can tell I'm Black, and so I get welcomed in very quickly. So I always felt like I had Black community. I felt like I understood myself in Blackness. Where I didn't feel I understood myself is in Japaneseness, because my main resource is my Japanese grandmother, who chose to leave Japan because she was obsessed with American movies. So she actively sought out American spouses during the Korean Wars when my grandfather was stationed there. And, she dated a couple people, and then she found the guy she ended up marrying, and she came here. And in coming here, she was shedding her Japanese citizenship, and therefore her Japanese-ness was gone as far as she was concerned. And I didn't understand that. I had to become an adult. I had to have these conversations with a whole bunch of mixed people to really understand that, like, your Japanese nationality is a bigger part of your Japanese identity than your culture or your heritage necessarily. Your ethnicity is not as prevalent, or at least for her, it wasn't. So she thought of her kids not as Japanese and white, she thought of them as Americans.
Right.
And she was becoming an American. And so my craving for like Japaneseness, she always would be like, "You're not Japanese. I don't understand why you care."
Mhm.
And that would be very hurtful to me because I didn't understand what she was saying, which is that I'm no longer a Japanese citizen. So why we're not Japanese anymore? And I think what I'm assuming from immigrant status, which I'm going to be having soon,
Mhm.
is the period of time it takes you to transition from, in her case, being Japanese to being American. In my case, I don't feel American in America. I'm a second
Mhm.
class citizen in America because I'm a
Mhm.
person of color, because
Mhm.
I come from an immigrant family and stuff like that. I go lower and lower down the tier. I don't get American status granted to me until I
Mhm.
leave the country.
Mhm.
When I leave the country, I get American status, and I can see instantly the privilege that it comes with
Right.
my blue passport. I know I'm going to experience that privilege where I'm going.
Yeah, the shift is really interesting. Is like
Is
how
it
you can.
jarring? Like, are you just
I mean, yeah, it's really confusing. How, one day you can be at the top of the social hierarchy and
mm,
a racial hierarchy, and the next you're not. But I think that's one of our strengths as mixed people. I think we
mm-hmm.
should use that as our power to be able to navigate. Not everyone can navigate that, and I'm not saying it's not hard, but we do have that ability.
Yeah, it's like a little bit of a superpower in being able to jump from community to community. And even though you're not like the perfect fit, you
You're like
blend.
a chameleon. One of my
Yes.
interviewees said, I'm like a chameleon, and I really feel like that was an um, accurate portrayal of
Mm-hmm.
what we go through. Yeah, no, absolutely. And the more, I stay in the US, it's been 8 years now. I don't feel American. I'm never gonna be American,
Mm-hmm.
but there's a lot of Americanness in me in my life now. Because like, why wouldn't it be? I mean, I'm
Right.
24/7 here,
Are you
and
feeling that your Frenchness or your do you identify as Belgian in any way just because you lived there, or more
I
French?
don't identify as Belgian in terms of like citizenship, but Belgium is a huge part of my life. Like,
Cultural identity to a
I do
degree.
Belgian beers, I do Belgian
Sure,
chocolate, I
yeah.
do Belgian waffles. Like, all my friends are in Belgium. My besties are in Belgium.
Yeah.
So it's one of my homes, definitely.
Do you
Um,
feel that you're like how am I'm trying to think of how I'm asking, because I'm kind of asking a citizenship question, but it's also an identity question of like, do you feel it draining your citizenship or your identity with France and Belgium? Do you feel like it getting smaller so that when you go back maybe to visit, that you don't feel quite natural there, as natural anymore there, now that it's
that's a
influenced
great
by your
question.
American
I
lifestyle?
mean, when I go visit there, I definitely feel American. Like,
You
I
do.
think in the American way, I act
Interesting.
very American. Um, and when I'm here, people are like, "Oh, you're so French," like, um, and then through my work now, especially recently, I've been um, through my work and this whole advocacy thing of this question of Japaneseness and mixedness has really come to the forefront of my life and my identity and how I think too. So, but before, as a 25-year-old, you just go through life, you party. Like, I didn't really think deeply about those things. It's really recently, getting in my closer to my 30s and now in my 30s and about to have a child, that those things are becoming so present and so heavy, and I have
Mm,
no answer. I'm just trying to navigate these
right.
things. And so, am I shedding my Frenchness? Um, it's just that I don't get to perform Frenchness.
Yeah.
I don't have a situation where I get to be French or
Right.
I get to be Japanese. Like the only situations I have is my once a week Skype call with my mom where I speak in Japanese. That's literally the most Japanese thing I will do. And French is the same. Like it's a couple quick phone calls I'll get from my dad. Maybe my cooking is really French. Yeah.
Yeah, well, again, that goes back to the thing about that craving community is that even if, like, it makes sense that you would attach to a general immigrant community of people, international immigrant community, versus specifically looking for Japanese French people because that's going to be a lot harder. It's a, you know, at least you have this crossover. And in mixedness, that's what we do, right? We're like, we see other mixed people and we're like, okay, you get this weird chameleon moment that I have to have because, and I don't have to explain it to you because you get it and we can just kind of sit in it. That craving of some form of community where you're just not the only one when so much of your life is you being the only one. I mean, that makes complete sense to me, but I feel like it's separate from what we're doing here for Militantly Mixed. Just I have so many questions about what it feels like as you start to feel your, if you even are aware of it, which you probably aren't until you go back to France. Like, what is the shedding process like? Do you just like, you're just sitting there interacting in your American culture so much that by the time you go home, you're like, oh, I do this thing now that I didn't used to do because this is something that they do in the States.
Yeah, like for example, consumerism is such a huge part of American culture.
It's pretty much everything here in the U.S.
Yeah, and so I don't abide by it, but when I go back home, I'm like, oh, I'm definitely different from all members of my family and my friends, or how they think about money, how they think about expenditure. Um, um, yeah, I mean, so those are really hard, and for me, I'm like, okay, like I accepted the fact that I'm likely gonna stay in the US most of my life and that I'm gonna just keep navigating that. But I'm comfortable with that situation now because I have a partner in crime, my husband, who is going through the same thing. But now when it goes to parenting, I'm like, what do you do with your kid who is gonna be American? Like by birth is gonna get the American citizenship. So get super different than what I'm gonna experience.
And on a multi-generational level, your child's grandparents are from two different countries.
Three different countries.
Three different countries. Your parents, your child's parents are also from different countries.
And everyone wants to have their, like the Indian grandparents were like, oh no, my grandkid is Indian. And you have to teach everything Indian. And I'm like, well, you know what? Like they'll go to school in the US, but then what do you do? Do you put them in bilingual school? Do you teach them? What kind of values do you teach them? Because the thing is, what I experienced, I was raised with a single mother who only spoke to me in Japanese in the Western world, where I went to a Belgian and French school. And I don't want to sort of replicate that experience for my kid in the sense that I was really two different people.
Yeah.
In those, at home, I was Maïko the Japanese. And at school, I was trying to fit in because otherwise I was the weirdo.
Right.
And I don't want that to happen for my kid. Like, yes, they're gonna have
some.
For sure, because again, coming from different culture, but how do you, and that's why before when I came to the US, I was really judgmental about assimilation or these parents or grandparents who chose not to teach culture. And like, I didn't understand. I was like, why aren't you so proud of your culture? Like, how can you eliminate that and just forget about your past and not, give that chance to the next generation. But now I really understand, because it is difficult to be different.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't even want your puppy to feel
Right.
excluded from the
Yeah.
dog park. Like, that's so when you have that sort of protective instinct, I definitely understand why somebody would like, no, you have to assimilate, like be what the majority is. Um
Oh,
and
you
if
hit on something that I've only been half thinking about. I've always wondered, like, why did my grandmothers give up what I'm assuming is a big part of their identity, which felt like so easy for them to shed it, to be here, and to think that, like, I don't even realize how American I am, and how, even though I am different as a mixed person, I can at least maneuver any place in the United States for the most part and not have too many challenges. And I only become aware of that when I leave the country. And
it
yeah,
may not
here,
have been for her, it may have been for her kids. You know what I like?
yeah. But you
Yeah.
don't think about that kind of stuff because you don't know your parents and you don't know your grandparents as people. I say this all the time. Like, you know them as your grandparents or your parents. You know, they're not, you don't know them as fully formed people. So even trying to figure out how to meet them like that, how to understand the decisions that they made and how they impacted your upbringing and the kind of decisions you're making that are going to impact your child. Like, yeah, I think, but that's touched on something because I've been saying things like, I'm going to go to Mexico and I'm going to get in there. You know, I'm going to learn the code. I'm going to try to adapt as much as possible. And I'm using different words. I'm using adapt, not assimilate. I'm using participate, you know, not get rid of, like, you know, I'm using words that make it seem like I'm not going to be doing exactly the same thing that probably both my grandmothers did, and probably the same in the case of your mom because she was an immigrant to where you grew up.
I mean, it's hard, and you know, I think what happened to me is my Japanese mom did not try to adapt. Like, she really much stayed Japanese. She worked for Japanese companies, so she would do job, come back home, be Japanese. So for me, I was educated as a Japanese person at home. And then in the school system, I was very much educated by the school system in a European way. But I had to do that job as a kid of
Yeah.
dissociating home versus like informal home culture versus formal school culture and friends culture. And there was such a clash because, you know, you're not supposed to talk about boys in Japanese culture. You're
Right.
not supposed to be loud. You're not supposed to have opinions and this and that. And nobody really taught me how to navigate that. And so part of me is like, if yeah, I'm very proud of my culture, and tomorrow if my kid is born, I'm gonna be, oh, you have to learn about French culture, Japanese culture, Indian culture. But then that's so much pressure to put on them because
And then they got to go to school and be American.
exactly, and
Yeah.
that's it's I'm not saying it's violent, but
It's jarring. It's physical.
it's
There's a,
physical, it's mental,
yeah.
it's like putting lot of pressure on saying, hey, you have to know all these things. You have to know how to behave in all these ways. You have to know all these customs, but you need to put a face and go to the
Yeah.
world as an American.
But I
So then
think
you
what's
get
going to
all
be different from your child is the fact that you can have the conversation you and I are having right now that I
mm,
can only assume our parents did not have. Right?
absolutely. Yeah.
Like, even though both of my parents are biracial, they weren't talking to me to prepare me for how my mixedness was going to carry out in the world. We, in silos, talked about the black stuff, the Japanese stuff. You know, like, we did that in silos. We didn't cross it over. You may have had something similar to that, or, you know, like you said, no one told you be Japanese at home, be French outside. You just picked that up from osmosis. You just experienced it, and you got the social cues that we just kind of naturally pick up in places. But you're having these conversations and you're studying stuff like this too. So you're going to have the tools to be able to probably really early on be talking to your kid, or just like, you're experiencing something that probably your friends aren't. But it's okay, because we're going to talk about it. When you're confused, we'll talk about it. I'm confused too. You know, like I think that's a different thing that's happening now that we're having conversations about being mixed more openly than even my parents' generation did. Um, it'll be a lot easier for people in that second generation tier to be able to talk, that, you know, that's happening now, to be able to talk to their children about it, and just like,
No, you're so right.
you're not going to be perfect. You know that you're not going to be perfect, but you're going to get further. I think your kid's going to be far more prepared because you have so much awareness to it. The other thing is you live in a really great city for experiencing. There's Japanese school, there's the
Yeah.
Buddhist temple, where I used to live in West LA, is the temple's
Lots of
right there.
mixed people in general. Yeah.
The Japanese school, the grocery stores are there. There's also the little Tokyo side of town as well. There's the French school. There's 2 or 3 French schools, I think. You know, so you could technically, you know, and I assume there's probably Hindi classes somewhere as well for kids. Like, I think there's ways that you'll be able to expose them, at least in the language side of things. But,
Yeah.
you know, it does mean more work for your child than other children that they're going to be around will experience. And they're going to resist it too, because you don't want to be different. So you do resist learning language. Here in the States, that's usually really common, resisting learning the family language because you don't want to be weird at school. And then you get to be an adult and you're like, shit, I wish I spoke my family's languages. Yeah, so I think you'll be more prepared, and you're just going to have so much more awareness that your child is going to be able to have a little bit more awareness than your generation.
No, I think your point is absolutely correct. Is there's a shift in parenting period. Like
Yes,
parents now, like active parenting means talking, communicating, and even about insecurities, which was not a thing, I think, in the past. You just worked, and just try to provide for your family. And that was what was put on a pedestal as being a good parent. Today is different. Like actively educating, discussing about these difficult, you know, issues.
And
Is
mental
at the
health. We talk
forefront.
about mental health now, which we didn't used to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So no, you're absolutely right. So maybe I shouldn't overthink this whole thing too much. But
Well, you're gonna, right? I mean, you're about to make a like you've made a person. That's gonna be a weird. I think I'm 45 and I'm not planning on having children, but it's always so wild to me that we make people. Like, I don't understand it. I get it, but it seems wild that we do this, and then we gotta make them. Then we gotta like teach them to be a
I
person.
know
It's
it's
so
such a
weird.
big yeah.
It's so
There's only
crazy.
so much you can do too, and because society is gonna happen to them.
Yeah, and you're not gonna be
So
there for every step.
um,
But this like I feel like I could talk. Well, I'm glad that you and I have a reason to be connected more, because you've triggered so many thoughts that I haven't really been able to actively, you know, work through. That I would love to talk to you more about stuff like this. I guess one thing before I ask the final question that I normally ask everybody, try to pinpoint a little bit of something. You had mentioned a comment earlier where you said something to the effect like you weren't really like actively, not that you didn't have an awareness of your mixedness, but you weren't like actively being able to participate like mixed, you know, before. Was it your transition to the States, or when do you feel like you started to go from just like you knew you were French at school and Japanese at home to being like a mixed person?
I think it's extremely recent.
Yeah.
Like
That's what it
I'm
sounds like.
talking like maybe a few months ago, and with so maybe this is a good time to talk about briefly my research and
Yeah.
CMRS.
Yeah.
They have been so my current research is on the identities and embodied and digital practices of people who identify as Black and Japanese, like you, for example. And what prompted me to start researching about this particular population is the documentary on Netflix about Naomi Osaka,
Yeah. That, oh
who
my
is
gosh, that one
who is
affected me so
Haitian
much.
and Japanese. And you know, the documentary was about a bunch of different things, but also her identity struggle. And I'm not Black and Japanese, but there's a lot of things that resonated with me. And I think that day, like up and watching that show, I realized I am mixed, and I am not French or Japanese. I'm French and Japanese and international and immigrant and a
Right.
woman, and all this intersectionality
Yeah.
makes me very complex. And and so that documentary really prompted me to do this research. And eventually I want to research about the whole Hafu population,
Mm.
but I wanted to focus on, Black and Japanese first in terms of like doing more racial equity work. And I feel like it was probably the most pressing population to look at first. But um, so I think it's really recent. That documentary came out in 2021, I think.
Yeah.
Then I started, and then recently I joined the Critical Mixed Race Studies Association and realized that, oh, there is a community. There are people looking into this. There are people studying this. It's not uncommon.
Mm-hmm.
But okay, I'm 31. I think back in the days at school, there were pretty much nobody in
Yeah.
Belgium. Like, it might be a thing here in the US, but it's not as much back
Even in the
home.
U.S., we had very few. Like the oldest person that I can think of awareness, like in the early '90s, was Naomi or like '90s was Naomi Zach, was like the only person I knew that was like doing something where mixedness was a part of
Mhm.
what they were talking about in
Mhm.
academia. So there are more now, and I have tons of people I or not tons. I have a few people I can connect you to if you want. But yeah, it's a
I
whole new
mean, there are
world.
people like you now who, like there's social media. There is
Right.
way more representation through the media and popular media, thanks to folks like you. But um, I don't think mixedness was an identity stamp or an identity marker for me
Right.
until I found these two big things in my life, which is this documentary and CMRS. Um, and I'm not sure if tomorrow, let's say I go back to France or I go back to Japan, that would still be a thing, because it's still very much in this American realm
Right.
that
Yeah.
I see mixedness. And I understand it and I discuss it in a very American way of understanding it, even though I come with this lens of being an immigrant. Um, so there is layers to that. I did create a performance, a choreography during grad school, which did not have an actual word title. The title was just question mark, exclamation point, question mark, exclamation point. That was my title, because I couldn't put words into sort of my fucked up mind and all that was going through. And it was multilingual. It was English, French, and Japanese. And um so I guess it's kind of started even during grad school because of
Sure.
these markers that people would put on me, or because there was one scene, for example, I just go to the Starbucks and I say my name is Maiko, but people was like Michael, manko in
Right.
Japanese
Yeah.
means vagina, and I'm like, what's going
Mm.
on? Like, why, why
Yeah.
can't I just be me? Or say, oh, can I have a pain au chocolat, which is like the quintessential French
Yeah.
breakfast? And people like, oh, chocolate croissant. And like, I was like, what is this world? Like, where am I? Like, I felt like a total alien. Um, and these are small, stupid things, but on a daily
But they're
basis,
not. Yeah. They
it
stack.
becomes a lot. And so I guess it may have started in grad school gradually, very gradually, but the Naomi Osaka documentary definitely was sort of the starting point of like, hey, I'm mixed
Mm. Okay.
and I need to do something about it, and I need to talk about it, and I need to find people to
Yeah.
talk to about it, because it's not easy.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So awareness wise, we'll say that it's more recent. Existence wise, it's just been there, but whether or not it's like screamed loud in your face or not, it was just kind of happening. But now that you have more of an awareness of it, one thing that I do like to ask everybody that comes on the show, because sometimes we talk a lot about trauma or isolation or whatever,
Mhm,
I
mhm,
like to see what do people love most about being mixed, which will be really
mhm.
interesting given that you have such a recent like marker as to when it's become a part of your actual identity.
What I like the most. Um, I think is my empathy towards difference, or towards um, people who feel different. And so I have maybe more patience towards that. Like, I don't know if somebody who has not experienced multiple culture hadn't had to navigate as much, like code switch as much as we do, have that same kind of understanding and patience and compassion towards sort of the visceral and embodied difficulties or navigation that goes into it. And I think again that's power. Like, I see as doubleness instead of seeing it as, oh, half, being half something or half
Oh my
other.
gosh. How are you and I not best friends already? Seriously. The amount of times I tell people it's more, not less. It's not half. It's like we're literally more than one thing. So why do we view it as this like smaller like we're smaller somehow?
Mhm,
Double,
mhm.
I like using it. Double makes sense. That's a good one too. Yeah,
I
okay.
mean, I think it multiplies. Like,
Yeah.
it's not like a mathematical, logical equation, and it's
Yeah.
that is just, it sort of multiplies, and like your empathy multiplies, your awareness multiplies, your way of behaving can multiply.
Yeah.
And so your identity is so polycultural in many ways.
I truly believe that being mixed and having to act, especially if you're actively having to jump from culture to culture, like at family gatherings or out in the world or whatever it is, I do fully believe that that amps up your empathy because you're forced to have to see people in different places dealing with different things and having to adapt to all those spaces. Yeah, that's one of the things I also agree. Empathy is such a I think it's so much more amplified when we have to have interactions with other cultures.
yeah,
You
like,
know.
I think we have the ability to, even if we don't agree with someone's perspective or way of behaving, we have the, the capacity to understand where they're coming from and why do they think this way, do things a certain way,
Mm.
which, because again, Japanese household, really Japanese,
Mm-hmm.
and it clashes with Western
So much.
ideologies.
Yeah.
um and in my whole life, I've my academic life, at least, I always lean and study towards African diasporic cultures, because I always felt like, I'm stuck with this Eastern Asianness, stuck with European aesthetics. And I'm like, I need to go out of that. I want to know something different.
Mm.
And so I've learned a lot about African diasporic cultures and heritages. And um, so I think it's that capacity of understanding others' perspective, other cultural,
Mm-hmm.
mental, whatever other perspective, ways of moving and behaving and being in the world, um, and being empathic about that, because we're all so different. And it's easy when you've been raised in a certain way with one monoculture to just sort of follow that trend or be against it. But
Mm.
instead, I think we're a little bit more fluid and a little bit more all over the place, like a little bit more
I agree. Yeah.
multidimensional in that.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree. Um, Thank you so much for joining me on this. I'm looking forward to what we're going to be, working kind of together on in the future. But I'm excited also to see what happens with your research. On a purely selfish way, the more Black Japanese mixes that get talked about, I think it's such a hard part of my mix and we can, talk about that too. It's such a hard part of my mix and maneuvering, especially on the Japanese side as a mixed Black person. So I would love to hear, and more than just my experience of what happens, the Osaka documentary, Hachimura's situation, like all of that is I'm paying so much attention to it. So I'm looking forward to that. Why don't you tell people, if you like to, how they can find you, or if there's something connected to your research that you're looking for?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I try to update my website, maikolelay.com, as often as possible with the project I'm currently involved in. So that's a good way to learn what I'm doing. If you are a scholar and academic, academia.edu, you can find me as well. I try to keep my social media as private as possible.
Makes sense.
But yeah, but stay in touch. CMRS is a great resource. I think we're both going to be involved in it for the next few years. So CMRS.org, please go and check it out and be involved as much as possible, and try to find other resources like this podcast or other organizations and groups in your area or virtually that you feel you can affiliate with, and that's been a huge support to me.
Militantly Mixed is a ManeHustle media podcast, produced and hosted by me, Sharmane Fury. Music is by David Bogan the One. You can follow us on social media on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Militantly Mixed. If you'd like to become a sponsor of Militantly Mixed, please go to patreon.com/militantlymixed for monthly sponsorship, or paypal.me/militantlymixed for a one-time only donation. And if you like what you hear on Militantly Mixed, please subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget to be your mixed-ass self.
ManeHustle Media. Turn your side hustle into your main hustle.